Hello, everyone. I'm not sure if it's my time to go, but I'm assuming it is. My name is Dr. Laura McGuire, and I will be providing the sermon today. I am so honored and happy to be here with you all and excited to discuss something that is so near and dear to my heart. The idea of blending trauma informed care within the context of a faith community. This is essentially my life's work, and bringing these ideas to the table, I think, can allow us to use our divine imagination. If you're non-theist, just imagination, but the ability to picture, envision, feel in a tactile way what a space that really feels safe and inclusive looks like. So I'm going to lead us to begin with in a guided visualization. So if you feel comfortable, you can close your eyes. And if you don't want to close your eyes, you can just look down or whatever is going to allow you to go into that space in your mind. Let's all take a deep breath to start. Grounding our bodies in this present moment and what we want to picture. I want you to imagine a faith community that you belong to, a space that you visit regularly, whether that's a physical space or a virtual space. But to start, I want us to imagine if we wanted to visit the physical space, that physical experience first. Imagine walking up to the building. What are some of the things you would like to see? What is the aesthetic, the outward appearance? How easy is it to access that physical space? What are some of the ways that stand out to you when you walk in the door and are greeted? How are you greeted? What are some of the comments that you want to hear? What if you need to be left alone? How would you communicate that? And what if, as soon as you walk in, you need to talk to someone? There's something heavy on your heart. For people who are into the energy, the vibes of a place, what is the energy like inside the sanctuary? What kind of colors radiate care to you? What kind of lighting, music, smells are present? Imagining this space and the people in it, how do you know if you can trust them? What kind of information about your life do you feel safe in sharing? What if you can't stop crying? Will people look strangely at you and ask you to leave or offer comfort and care? After the service, when you depart, what does follow-up look like in this space? How are you greeted on your way out? And what if you need resources and to further connect with caregivers? What does that look like to you? Do you feel like you can trust this congregation and its leadership with your story? With all the broken parts, the mistakes, perhaps feelings of guilt or shame? Can you share this, or do those stories get abbreviated to be more palatable? Now, as we move through this service, I want you to keep in mind this vision. I want us to think about it and this mosaic of care for the spaces we would like to create for the world. Next slide, please. We know that the majority of people walking this planet, the person sitting to either side of us, have experienced trauma of some kind. We know even in the most acute versions of physical and sexual violence, the statistics are incredibly high. Though studies vary, approximately 1 in 6 boys and 1 in 4 girls, and for people in the middle of that spectrum, the statistics are even higher, will experience interpersonal violence before they blow out the candles on their 18th birthday cake. But that's something I want us to include, but put in a bubble for a moment, because so often that is its own discussion. How do we care for those who have experienced violence outside of our faith communities? But I really want us to think about when survivors of any type of violence are coming into faith communities, what are some of the triggers of simply being in theological spaces? Now, I know as you use, we often think, well, we've got that down. We're doing so much better, right? We have often come here because we experienced pain in the past in other ideologies that were more corrosive. But it's so vital that we acknowledge that sometimes we carry some of those traits into these new spaces. And sometimes people are coming in with that trauma of religious trauma in and of itself, and then the complex and compound experience of all of the other types of violence that they might have interacted with before. Next slide, please. So to start off, we have to start at the beginning, as much of a beginning as we can recall in our collective memory. And this is the work of understanding our historical trauma. None of us are coming into this space today out of a vacuum, right? We all have these stories, these lived experiences that are written into the tapestry of who we are. And part of that is our ancestral trauma. Religious historical trauma can come from generations of fear-based theology, right? Even if we maybe grew up in a more open and expansive space, we are still carrying that epigenetic memory. Add to that so many of us come from stories that include religious hegemony, that certain belief systems overrode and tried to distinguish others. That is in ourselves. The Crusades, colonization, even within Europe, much less without, the Inquisition, missionaries. The world of theology and faith community is ripe with past pain. And it's easy to say, but that is in the past and we are in the present. But we also have to acknowledge that all of these times coexist in this present moment. And all of those histories are deeply embedded within our bodies and within the spaces we create together. Even in more modern times, that has not gone away. We see so much systemic abuse still going on in all religious spaces and all humanist spaces. We still see that this is a constant problem. And I think part of this is because we don't want to look to the past. We want to believe we have swept it under the rug, but that dust is going to come out, and we can see that in what is currently going on. So by understanding this problem as the past being very much part of the present, we can address it, we can start to heal it, but it takes that acknowledgement instead of trying to create an illusion that everything is better now. Next slide, please. And for many of us, this is our present story, right? We come from these messages of religious trauma that are just deeply embedded in our psyche. We might have grown up with the idea that our simple existence, the fact that we are alive, that we were born into this world, requires a need for redemption. What that can create, what that can manifest in our lives is this feeling of constant anxiety and shame, right? even though we say, yes, but that was in the past, have we fully acknowledged how it has impacted us? We might have grown up with the message that any kind of desire or joy is a sin, is a problem, is a thing to atone for, right? Growing up myself, I was always fascinated by the fact that anything that people were really interested in or excited about would often be framed as an idol, an obstacle to holiness, right? So all of that joy, all of that desire was always saddled with this feeling of shame, and that can create fear of our body and our feelings. I'm really happy right now. Is that something I should feel bad about? Joy, again, often being linked to idolatry. On the flip side, our existence, our desire, our joy are put in this box of negativity, but suffering is often seen as some part of a plan and something that we need to embrace. Now, everybody has different views on this, right? And some people might say, that really actually works for me, and that's something I like to embrace. So I am not shaming anyone who does feel that kind of mentality works for them. But if that doesn't work for you, separating this and not feeling like suffering needs to exist in our lives, or that it has been gifted to us by some higher power, but instead that it is complex and unknowable, all of the reasons why suffering exists, and that if we don't want it to be part of this narrative of a plan or divine order or purpose, we are allowed to do that. We are allowed to reject that and find different narratives that do work for us. Something else that I think is really unique in particular cultures that are more individualistic is this idea of salvation being personal. And that can be divine salvation or earthly salvation, right? This idea of well-being, whether in the present or afterlife, we often grow up with this idea that it is about me, right? If I'm okay, I don't have to care about anyone else. I grew up in the evangelical and Catholic world. Yes, I got both. And that was a big part of our collective consciousness. I'm here to save myself, and everybody else, well, good luck to them. This can lead to, even after we leave that, this continued feeling of disconnect, and especially disconnection from social well-being. If we are focused on an individual afterlife, guess what? We're often going to be focused on an individualistic earthly life. And where oftentimes we see this disconnect, where those of us who have left this and become more progressive in wanting social well-being and justice, and those who might struggle with understanding that, so much of this comes from our theology. Next slide, please. The next thing I want to share with you are some thoughts about some of the myths and mythologies that live because of these spaces that we are often coming from. Next slide, please. One of the books that I read during a personal study, a personalized class that I took in seminary, was this book, The Survivor. And it is a book based on the experiences of different individuals who survived the Holocaust. And it brought up a lot of really interesting points about collectivist cultures and their suffering. Because so often, even in the world of psychology, there is this concept of what it means to go through trauma and what that experience looks like, but that is very individualistic in its foundation. Some of the things that the book shared that challenge some of the assumptions we make about those who go through all different types of trauma are this idea that survivors always experience guilt. And that is not universal. The book challenges that. It says, yes, in the individualistic worldview, there is going to be more of, I survived this, someone completely separate from me didn't, and a feeling of guilt might come up. But interestingly, in the collectivist cultures that they studied, the survivor feels more of a responsibility. Your suffering was my suffering because we are connected to each other. My survival, therefore, is our survival. And I have this responsibility to echo the voices of my community throughout the rest of my life because of that interconnection. I will touch on this more in a second, but something else that I want to put out there and challenge us about is this idea that forgiveness is required to heal. There are so many examples of other cultures' expectations around this concept of forgiveness and how it is more multifaceted than what a lot of us grow up with in the United States and in the West. Another great book on that, if you're interested, is The Sunflower, which explores different perspectives on what alternatives to forgiveness look like. Next slide, please. When we talk about this idea of letting go, of forgiving, even within ourselves, because so often survivors are coming into this space struggling with accepting their own experiences, their own story, separate from needing to forgive or accept anything else from someone outside of themselves. And this really comes down to these two ideas that come from the Torah, and that is teshuvah and kapara. Teshuvah is translated often as repentance, but really what it comes down to is an idea of returning. And what are we returning to in teshuvah is our divine self, our ultimate way of being. We in Judaism, we have this idea that we have two souls at all times, an animal, a mammalian soul, and then divine spark, a divine soul. And so to practice teshuvah is to remember, oh yes, I have this side of myself that really is wonderful and makes great choices and is all of the things I want to be. And perhaps I've forgotten that for a moment. And there's things that I need to accept that I've done, but there's always this path that I can return to. Kapara then asks us to actually do the work of restoring what has been broken, to take those steps, to take the action of I'm sorry in our lives and in our communities. Next slide, please. And that leads us to thinking about how we conceptualize forgiveness. Now, this is just a topic that I have done a lot of research on in seminary because it's very interesting to me. I recently watched a documentary that I thought was very well done called Great Photo, Lovely Life. And it is about a family reckoning with their history of having a sexual predator within their immediate family and all of the pain that that has caused within the world, within their community, and within the family itself. And one of the things that is shown in the film is that this family is coming from an evangelical Christian background, which focuses a lot on forgiveness. And oftentimes, the family members who are still in that faith space are pushing this narrative onto the survivors in the family. They're saying to them that famous quote many of us grew up with, you will be forgiven as much as you forgive, essentially threatening them with forgiveness and saying that if you do not absolve this person in your heart of what they have done to you, if you still have pain and anger in any way, then somehow God will turn that back on you and hurt you for it. And this has become so common. And it's interesting, right? Because even in secular spaces, we still often hear people say you have to forgive. But forgiveness is complex. And I hope that is something that we stay with here today. If people are coming into our faith community, not to say that there is one path forward, one path to healing, but to allow there to be nuance. Because not all religions see this the same way. And I often say that forgiveness really fits into these two categories. So when we're using this one word, if we're going to use it, we need to be very clear on what we're talking about in order to be really trauma informed. Are we saying that we're asking people to come into a space of acceptance that what happened happened, and now we have to understand what it looks like to move forward? Or are we asking for absolution? And is that necessary in that particular instance? Within Judaism, we have three types of forgiveness, which I love. So there's that understanding that this is nuanced and complex. The first one is salicha, which is a forgiveness of letting things go. And this is often when there's an accident, right? You walk into someone in the street and you bump them. And you say, "Oh, I'm so sorry I bumped you. Oh no, I bumped your coffee and it got on your shirt. And what can I do to make this better?" Right? And the person can say, "In my heart, I let this go. I understand. We were just both walking fast and it's okay." And there still is that kapara there, right? Can I get you a napkin? Do I need to help you pay for dry cleaning, right? Whatever it is to do the I'm sorry, even if it's a mistake. And then there's mechila. And mechila is challenging us when something is bigger than that, to do the longer work, right? If someone is in a car accident and there's an injury or fatality, there will be work to do to address that. The past cannot be rewritten and we can't make that not happen, but we can say, what are the pieces of work that I can do to repair this? And lastly, for the most egregious of crimes, like this family experienced with the predator within their midst, there is this idea that kapara actually only belongs to God. That for victims of interpersonal violence, whether it's domestic violence, sexual assault, child abuse, they do not need to either accept or absolve anything, but instead can find peace in understanding that, yes, the past is the past, and I can still feel those feelings and yet move forward into a brighter tomorrow. God will take care of the rest. And again, there is no message here of what to understand about this or where you should land, but instead to open our minds and expansiveness on what these things can look like for different people. Next slide, please. So to conclude my time with you today, I want to leave us with some ideas now that we have this rumination of the past, what many of us grew up in the present of our existence in this life, and in understanding the different ways that survivors will come into spaces and either experience acceptance and affirmation or re-traumatization. So what can we do to move forward and create some of the places that we might have envisioned in that first piece? Number one is that we continue to have these conversations. We don't leave it to a one-time thing. Oh yeah, we talked about trauma that one time that person came in and yeah, we're good. Check the box. Now, this should be a regular part of our sermons or Devar Torah, our lessons, our studies. Are we talking about the way that trauma impacts us and our world? We want to make sure that these conversations, though, are not based in shock value, because that is incredibly common too. So much is often this regurgitation of terrible pain and terrible horrors, and this idea that that will create empathy, but research has shown us it doesn't. So instead, we want to focus on solutions to these problems and ways of healing. We want to make sure that everybody has an understanding of what to do if someone does disclose to them. Oftentimes, clergy have this, right? At least some cursory understanding of what to do when someone shares their pain. But we know that that is not the first person people will usually tell, right? It will be somebody who they're sitting next to, somebody they see regularly at a book club or a discussion. And so we want to make sure everyone knows how to keep those stories in safety and honor them. Lastly, if we are going to be spaces that create community, we need to be a space that has clear resources. We don't want to simply say, "I'm so sorry that happened to you," but instead be able to offer direct places that people can go and get the support that they need. We can also collect funds to support these services so that when someone is in crisis, the first thing they think of is to call our community, because they know there they will get the support that they need. I appreciate everyone spending this time with me this morning to have this conversation. And I look forward to any questions you'd like to explore afterwards. I'm sure my contact information will be shared as well. But let us conclude this time together, going back to that picture that we had in our mind and thinking more fully of what a trauma informed faith community can look and feel like. Thank you.